I've always been a visual person, um, and it started with my clothes as a teenager, and then I graduated to any place I lived. Um, I decorated, and finally in my 40s I started to take art courses, and then I decided to go to art school. Um, and I wanted to be able to graduate from being a bad artist to being a mediocre artist. That was my aspiration. I had enough material under my belt to apply to OCAD because you had to do an interview and you had to have a portfolio, which I did have, sort of. And I remember after I applied and went up to do the interview, I got back into my car in the basement parking lot across the street, and I started sobbing. And I didn't really understand why, but it was this incredible feeling of relief and excitement that I was finally going to do what I really chose to do. I loved going to art school. And I also liked teaching. I found teaching was a really creative thing for me. I enjoyed it. But after a certain point, I needed to move on to something else. And the visual had always been really important to me. I went to art school because I wanted to find out what one painted if one wasn't copying photographs. So I found out there. I had an assignment in my 4th year, and it was to make a work of art that was based on the support or the substrate rather than on the painting, the image that was on top of the so-called canvas or wood. Because the professor explained that with the advent of photography, this idea of verisimilitude really became passé because it was taken over by photography. So painters at that point became interested in the physical elements that went into a painting, like the paint or the support. So we had to make a work of art that dealt with the support. And this was like duck soup to me because I'd always been really interested in lath and plaster walls. I loved the way lath looked on an exposed plaster wall. It was like an image of the past. So that was my first piece of original successful art. I was really interested in the textures of the world, the surface textures of the world, and I found myself trying to reproduce them on a sort of a literal level. So after lath came all kinds of stuff embedded in plaster. You know, stuff from my recycling bin. And then I started cutting up tin cans and cutting them in shapes that mimic the lines in a plowed field as a landscape, a literal landscape. And I'm actually a fairly literal person. Like, I don't do stuff out of my own head. I need something to look at. And mostly that's what I see around me. Okay, I experiment. I don't know what I'm doing. I go over and over and over things again. And one time there was one of the teachers said, there's 2 approaches to things. I think this is an overstatement, but painting can be additive or subtractive. And I'm a subtractive person. What really matters to me is, what I know about myself is that I can't prejudge necessarily what it's going to look like. I have to put the mark down, judge it, walk away, and either I take it off or I don't. But I don't really know what's going to happen. I can't let any of them go until I know they're right. And I'm sure that's the same with all artists. But they take me a long time. I really love the beauty that's in the ordinary. And some of it is easily overlooked. And I like to surprise people. Like this business of the steel siding is, to a certain extent, a bit of a surprise that you can paint on it, that you can. And the reason I had the idea for the steel siding was driving out to Battersea one day, and there was a shed with a tree beside it, and the sun was shining directly through the tree branches, and the branches were being reflected on the steel roof. So I like the fact that I noticed that, and that I can try and convey it through my work. There's an artist called Mark Bradford who I really like, and he works with found materials, and he says he brings the stuff, his materials, out from the world, and then tries to beat some sort of beauty into them. And that's kind of the way I feel about it. But it's an enormous direction in art, making fine art out of found materials. When I actually graduated and came back from art school, and I hadn't had any problems doing the work in art school, but when I came back in my front room, I got totally anxious and neurotic and could barely work. And then Sue Sheedy invited me to come and look at her studio, and there was a vacant studio in that Princess Street, and I moved in there. So that made an enormous difference, of having other artists to talk to and asking people what they thought. But after 10 years of being there, I decided that I was mature enough to move into my own space. And I am, but I do miss the ongoing feedback. One thing I know about practicing art is that discipline is everything. And if you don't do it regularly, it becomes increasingly difficult to get back at it. And I read a book about Lucian Freud, and Lucian Freud said that what really mattered was keeping up your morale. And keeping up your morale is a really hard thing to do in making art. So the show. Being able to show my work publicly means the world to me. I try and convince myself to a certain extent that I can keep working without anybody ever seeing it besides my friends, but it doesn't really work that way. So I haven't had a solo show for 4 years now. I've been in group shows, but this has really pushed me to explore the work on the steel siding. One of my professors said that the most interesting work that was being done these days is cross-genre. So initially, when I was in Florence, I made prints of the rocks that were making up the Medici palaces. And I used paint and carving to put it together. Well, I gouged into plywood, and then I stretched canvas on top of that, on top of the gouged work, and then I rolled in with paint. So that's what that piece is. And then not really knowing what I was doing, because I was doing a new sort of printmaking, I guess. But I kept rolling over to see what different colors would evolve and then how it would look. But one reason I started to do that was that Patterson knew, and I read that one of his initial intentions with his gouged work was to make prints out of them. But he liked them so much by painting and staining them that he didn't do it. So I thought I would try and do what Patterson Ewan didn't do, i.e. make a print from my gouging. So these pieces that I'm doing now on the steel, I found out that I could take the paint off with lacquer thinner. So that was exciting to me because I can manipulate the paint on these rather unforgiving surfaces by taking it off. When it came to the lath, I liked the natural surface of the lath. I liked the color of the pale color that the lime made in it. But when I started gouging into it, I could paint into the gouges, right? But again, that's a very unforgiving process. And I have to think a very long time before I make a mark with the Dremel. Maybe I'd be more spontaneous if I were having to whip a whole bunch of them off, but I don't have to. But I am free because I can take off what I've put on. I often think when I'm doing this stuff, if I come in here and I can't find the mark I'm looking for or the color I'm looking for, I think of that Leonard Cohen song, Waiting for the Miracle to Come. And it is like a miracle. It is a sort of a miracle when it turns up out of the blue.